In 1931, a 79-year-old reverend, by the name of Robert Brooks, wrote a series of articles in a local newspaper, describing his encounters with John Wesley Hardin, the notorious Texas gunman, during Hardin's brief hideout in Alabama. At that time Hardin was going by the name of John Swain, after fleeing Texas for the murder of a county sheriff. He chose the area of Pollard, Alabama, on the Alabama and Florida border, because his wife, Jane Bowen, had relatives there. While there, he would often slip across the state line to a bustling small Florida town called Bluff Springs, which, with all of its saloons, reminded him of his days in Texas. In this small Florida town, is where Hardin met the future preacher, who years later remembered Hardin, and his small group of compadres, and chose to write about them.
One among the politest and nicest-looking men I came in contact with, in my young days, turned out to be one of the hardest cases, a desperado who killed 35 men in Texas and Kansas, when the Wild West was in the making. In the spring of 1877, he came to Bluff Springs, where I lived at the time, who said his name was Hardin. He was a fine upstanding person, with a high forehead, curly hair, and deep blue eyes, and looked more like a college professor than what he turned out to be. He and I got to be real chummy. I always had high ideals, and he seemed to be above the average intelligence, and we had our views in common on a good many things. I found he was well educated, and appeared to be a fine character, but there was just one thing against him, and that was the company he kept. He was a constant companion to the bad men of Santa Rosa County, of whom I wrote of in a former article. That crowd always carried pistols and generally wore them buckled on the outside of their clothing, but if Hardin ever carried a gun, I never saw it. It developed later that things were getting too hot for him in the West, and he decided to visit his old friend of former days, so he came over this way to see him. He drank a great deal, but I never saw it have any effect on him. He confided to me that his father was a Methodist preacher in Texas, and he was named after the founder of Methodism, John Wesley. He stayed around during the spring of that year and well up into summer, hanging out in Alabama, and Bluff Springs, and over the river into Santa Rosa County. Very soon it began to be whispered around that John Wesley Hardin was wanted for murder in Texas. I could scarcely believe it, and if it had not been for the company he kept, no one would have thought much of the rumor.
The second member of Hardin's gang was none other than his brother-in-law, Joshua Robert Bowen, who went by the name Brown. Brown Bowen was born in Walnut Hill, Florida, in 1849, but moved with his family to Texas as a boy. His sister, Jane Bowen, married Hardin in Texas. On December 17, 1872, he and Hardin were drinking at a saloon in Gonzales County, Texas, and in cold blood, Bowen shot another saloon patron, named Thomas Holderman, as Holderman was sleeping under a tree. Bowen was arrested for the murder, and jailed in the Gonzales County Jail. On June 17, 1873, Hardin helped Bowen escape from the jail. Like Hardin, Bowen eventually fled to Alabama, where he had relatives.
Brooks remembered this about Brown Bowen. About the worst desperado that was ever in this section is Brown Bowen. He was born 10 miles from Atmore, Alabama, in Walnut Hill, and his father and mother were loved and respected by all who came in contact with him, and as far as I know, the boy was an exemplary youth, but he went out to Texas when the West was in the making, got in with a bad set, as boys will, and learned their ways, and got to be an expert with a gun, and a crack shot, and before he left Texas he had killed several men. I first knew him at Bluff Springs, around 1874, when he returned from the West, and took up his abode in the upper end of Santa Rosa County, just across the Escambia River from Bluff Springs, where the town of Jay, Florida, is now located, which at the time was about as isolated a section as there was in this part of the country. He married an estimable young woman of that county, and one son came of the union, who turned out to be a splendid young man. Brown gathered around him a class of men like himself, among them Bob Hardy, Shep Hardy, and a lot of others, all whom are now dead. When I went to Bluff Springs, in 1872, there were 4 saloons, and Brown and his crowd were constant patrons of them. When sober, he was a friendly sort, but when drinking, which was often, he had an ugly temper, and was dangerous. He lived over the river, where he lived mostly by running logs to Bluff Springs Mill, and selling them. The logs he sold mostly were the property of a mill company, which was 15 miles further down the river, but a little matter like that never touched the conscience of Bowen and his crowd.
The final members of Hardin's last gang were Robert and Shep Hardy. The brothers were born in Santa Rosa County, Florida, and both fought in the Civil War. Robert was a Confederate deserter, who later joined the Union Army. Brooks had this to say about Bob Hardy.
In a former article, I mentioned the name of Bob Hardy as being a companion of Brown Bowen. I knew him well. In those days, I had the happy faculty of getting on with anybody, and while I did not mix with them much, they were all friends of mine. In a way, at least they were always friendly with me. Bob Hardy was one of the toughest characters I ever knew. He could drink more whiskey, and carry it, could talk bigger, and swear the loudest, and tell more smutty yarns than any man I ever came in contact with. He was born and reared in Santa Rosa County, Florida, and his holding out place was near where the beautiful town of Florida, is now located. Stealing logs was most of his business, and patronizing the saloons kept him busy.
Like his brother, Shep Hardy also fought in the Confederate Army. He and Hardin briefly went into the logging business together, but both liked to gamble a lot. Shep Hardy was with Hardin when Hardin was captured in Pensacola, Florida, in October of 1877. He was released from custody and not charged with a crime. Hardin met his fate at the end of a gun, in 1895, after his release from prison. He was murdered inside of a saloon, in El Paso, Texas, where he was shot in the back. Brown Bowen was captured in Florida, and was returned to Gonzales, Texas, where he was hung in 1878, for the murder of Holderman. There were over 4,000 spectators to the hanging. Shep Hardy was struck and killed by a train, in Alabama, in 1889, which he was attempting to rob. Robert Hardy was later sent to prison in Mississippi, for the sexual assault on a child. He died in prison, in 1901. And so ended John Wesley Hardin's last gang.